In 1915, in Beijing, a publication called Youth Magazine was quietly published. This magazine was later renamed New Youth, and it also kicked off a cultural movement, the New Culture Movement. There was no war, no regime change, and even the movement had little influence at first. But what it tried to do was very bold, to change the thinking of the Chinese people, and even to reshape the spiritual outlook of the whole nation. It took place in a chaotic time when the old world had just disintegrated and the new order was still far away. Today, we're going to speak from this crack and see how it really happened. Until the 19th century, China was the center of East Asia and was known as the Great Kingdom of Heaven. But after the Opium Wars, that confidence collapsed almost overnight. In 1840, Britain opened the gates of China with its gunboats. What followed was a series of unequal treaties, reparations, land cessions, and the opening of trade ports. But these were really just the beginning. It was the Sino-Japanese War of 1895 that really started the Chinese to reflect deeply. That year, the Qing government and Japan broke out in conflict. Originally many people thought that China, big land and vast territory, how can not lose to a small Japan? But unexpectedly, the Beiyang fleet was completely wiped out, almost a one-sided defeat. The blow was too great. When Li Hongzhang signed the Treaty of Shimonoseki, the Japanese representative next to him even said, "Today is not only the death of the country, but also the destruction of the species." These words were transmitted back to the country, making countless intellectuals painfully aware of the situation. After the Sino-Japanese War, China's cultural elite began to really question, where exactly is the problem? Before the foreign affairs movement to engage in railroads, telegraph, military industry, technology imported a lot, the result as usual cannot beat others. Is it that we do not learn enough? Is not the system out of the problem? So some people look to the Western system, believing that constitutionalism, parliament, and democracy are the fundamentals of a strong country. In 1898, Kang Youwei, Liang Qichao and others launched the 100 Days Reform, with the emperor's pro-government, reform of the imperial examinations and the establishment of academies, which seemed to have good momentum. But only 100 days, this change of law was forcibly terminated by Empress Dowager Cixi. The change of law failed, the 6 gentlemen were killed. China's modernization was, once again, blocked. 10 years later, the Xinhai Revolution led by Sun Yat-sen finally overthrew the Manchu dynasty and established the Republic of China. This was a historic breakthrough, the emperor was gone and China became a republic. But soon people realized that the emperor was out of power, but the problem was still far from being solved. The Beiyang warlords were in power, there were wars all over the country, the government was weak and incompetent, and the people continued to live in hardship. What was even more frustrating was that the foreign powers did not leave. The great powers set up leases in China, controlling railroads, minerals, and financial lifelines, and although China was ostensibly independent, it was still controlled in practice. This has caused many to turn from external shocks to internal introspection. Some people say it's the Chinese culture itself. Is it that we have been too preoccupied with heavenly destiny and superstitious about ethics since ancient times, but lacking in scientific rationality? Is it that our education has made people read to death and not understand the world? Is it that we have not learned to question authority for thousands of years? These questions were very acute in those days. And the participants of the New Culture movement were the very group of people who, with these questions, tried to find answers. They were no longer satisfied with the introduction of technology, no longer expected to rely solely on the change of political system. They wanted to start from the most fundamental ideology and culture, to have a thorough transformation. If the collapse of the great powers brought about a shock to the mind, the 1910s was one of the most anxious, and confusing, times in China. The Xinhai Revolution overthrew the imperial system and established a republic, but a republic that was not as clear and controllable as people thought. After the abdication of the Qing emperor, Yuan Shikai came to power, who nominally embraced the republican system, but in reality, step by step, he restored dictatorship, even going so far as to try to proclaim himself emperor in 1915. This chilled the nation. 10 years after the revolution, everything seems to be back to square one. And at the local level, the Beiyang warlords were divided and fragmented. With Sun Yat-sen forming a government in the south, and Duan Qirui entrenched in Beijing in the north, there was constant military and political chaos, and the country had almost no stable central authority. The common people lived in the midst of war and inflation, while the intellectuals, on the other hand, lived in the heavy loss after their ideals were dashed. When the hopes of the system were shattered by reality again and again, people began to reflect, is it that we have been pinning our hopes on system or power, when in fact the root lies in the culture itself? Is it true that if the emperor, the president, and the parliament are changed 1,000 times, if the people's mindset does not change, the society will still not be able to get out of the predicament? At this time, Beijing became the center of intellectual activity. Beijing in the 1910s was a place of intertwined contradictions. On the one hand there was the afterglow of the palace, and on the other the germ of new ideas. This was especially true of Peking University, where the freest and most active group of intellectuals and young students in China were gathered. In 1912, Cai Yuanpei became president of Peking University. He was an educator who studied both East and West, believed in liberalism, and promoted open-mindedness. He proposed freedom of thought, inclusiveness, and refused to draw boundaries based on political positions, allowing all kinds of ideas to be freely expressed at Peking University. On the Peking University campus at the time, there were daily debates: should we abolish the literary language? Does Confucianism still represent the spirit of the nation? Should Chinese people believe in religion? Those issues that seem old-fashioned to us today were, at the time, as heated as Mars colliding with Earth. It was in the midst of this cultural fervor that in 1915, Chen Duxiu founded a magazine in Shanghai, the Youth Magazine, later renamed New Youth. This publication, like a spark of thought, ignited the entire era. He proposed that the banners of Mr. De and Mr. Sci, that is, democracy and science, should be held high. In today's ears, this is a perfectly normal slogan. But in those days, it pointed straight to the soft underbelly of traditional Chinese culture. What is democracy? It's not who will be the official, but people have the freedom of expression and the right to criticize. What is science? Not bottles and jars in the laboratory, but the spirit of skepticism and truth-seeking. He believed that to save China, one must first save ideas; to save ideas, one must first dare to question those sacrosanct traditions. The New Youth, at that time, talked not only about politics, but also about language, literature, education, family, and even love and marriage. It brought enlightenment from the intellectual elite into the everyday world of ordinary youth. In Beijing, in Changsha, in Hangzhou, young people all over the country responded by reading New Youth, participating in writing, and joining in debates. For a time, a never-before-seen intellectual tension emerged in China. On the eve of May 4th, the old world had not yet fallen, but the new world was already shouting. And it was at this moment that a group of intellectuals, Chen Duxiu, Hu Shi, Lu Sun, Li Dazhao, Qian Xiantong, came together. They were not a unified faction, nor did they have a complete program. But they shared a common anxiety: how to transform the Chinese people. This cultural reboot came not by the barrel of a gun, but by the written word, the podium, the periodicals, and a mind that was not willing to be silent. They believed that transforming China must begin with transforming the spirit. Many people think that movements are always sensational. But the new culture movement began precisely not with a massive mass action, but with the self-doubt of a group of people. Who were these people? Not warlords, not revolutionaries, but intellectuals. In their lecture halls, at their desks, in a single essay, they asked a deeper question: what is China's problem, really? A few years have passed since the Xinhai Revolution, but we see a republic that is no better than the imperial system. The system has been changed, but it seems that the people's state of mind, the logic of the operation of society, and the relationship between people have not really changed. So they asked, is it possible that we have been going in the wrong direction from the beginning? Hu Xi was one of the first to propose the path of reflection. He studied in the United States and was influenced by Dewey's experimentalism, and when he returned to China he shouted out the phrase, "Bold assumptions, careful proof." This phrase is not only an attitude toward scientific research, but also a new attitude toward culture, history, and tradition. He wrote articles criticizing the old literary language and advocating vernacular language. He advocated that literature should serve to express true emotions, not to imitate the ancients. A literary revolution, he said, is the outpost of an intellectual revolution. His language was not vehement, but sharp as a knife. His proposition is to demolish the high walls of a nation's self-enclosed mind. Unlike Hu Shi, who was gentle and refined, Chen Duxiu was more like a fire. He bluntly criticized Confucianism, arguing that the three principles, loyalty, filial piety, and righteousness had long been shackles to the advancement of Chinese society. He wrote successive articles in New Youth, proposing, let's knock down the old morals and build a new culture. His articles were sharp, fierce, and painful. But behind them lay an extremely deep concern. He says, what the Chinese have always had is a submissive mentality, what they don't have is a reflective spirit. What he wants to do is to wake up this whole generation. Cai Yuanpei, on the other hand, proposed to replace religion with aesthetic education. He did not want people to stop believing, but he wanted the Chinese to build a modern personality from within. Faith is not true faith if it is only obedience to orders, he said. That's why he pushed Peking University to introduce courses in philosophy, fine arts, and psychology, encouraging students to be exposed to different ideas, not by standardizing them, but by making their own judgments. Although Lu Xun was not directly involved in the editor-in-chief of New Youth, he published Diary of a Madman, which became the classic text of this intellectual enlightenment. He tells the history of a family's cannibalism in the voice of a madman. This was not literature, but a wake-up call for the collective memory of the Chinese people. He said, "Save the children." Not referring to the teenager in front of him, but to the long-lost conscience and reason of our entire nation. The new culturists of this period did not have a regime, a gun, or even a united front. But they sowed seeds among the populace in a very special way, through publications, lectures, classes, and the vernacular language. They believed that as long as the youth awakened, China's hope would not sink. They also believed that if they were to make a real revolution, they had to change the structure of the Chinese mind first. Not to bring down a dynasty, but to break that spiritual cage rooted in thousands of years of culture. All this is just the beginning. There were no marches, no rallies, but minds were already in turmoil. People began to really think. If every failure in the past has been because we've only changed the system but not the hearts and minds, then isn't it time for us to do a revolution of the mind like never before? And so, a battle without smoke was quietly waged in the minds. The new culture movement is not perfect, and it has many blind spots, such as excessive westernization, elitism, and disconnection from reality. But it raised questions that still haunt us today. What kind of Chinese do we want to be? How to integrate tradition and modernity? How should the boundaries between the individual and the collective be drawn? This cultural experiment, in the end, did not bring about dramatic institutional changes, but it planted many seeds. The vernacular language, academic freedom, and citizenship. Today are seemingly ordinary concepts that were first introduced in that very era. In the next episode, we'll continue to explore what was at the very core of this movement. Democracy and science, in that not-so-democratic and not-so-scientific era, how it was understood, and how it was promoted. You're welcome to leave a comment in the comments section about how you feel about this period of history.